In 1955, one American company controlled 85% of all intercity travel in the United States. Not the airlines, not the railroads, a bus company. 30 years later, that same company could not stay out of bankruptcy court. And here is the part that should stop you. It did not lose because a competitor beat it. It lost because of a decision made in a boardroom at the exact moment it had no competitors left at all. By the end of this video, you will recognize the precise kind of thinking that killed it. Not a single mistake. A way of seeing the world, less than the price of a house in the neighborhood where he built the factory. The brand survived, the company did not. This is the story of a man who turned surplus plastic and used machine tools into a childhood institution, to a failed car salesman standing in the snow in Hibbing, Minnesota. His name was Carl Eric Wickman, and that winter he had almost nothing. He had come to America from Sweden in 1905, a young man with no English and no money, and he had gone to work the only place that would take him, the iron ore mines of northern Minnesota. He cut ore underground until the mine decided it no longer needed him. Then it let him go. To understand what he did next, you have to understand the country he was standing in. America in 1914 was not yet a connected place. The railroads were powerful, but they were locked to their tracks, and those tracks went where the money already was, between the cities that already mattered. Aviation existed, barely. It was experimental, expensive, and, for most ordinary people, genuinely frightening. The automobile was beginning to appear on American roads, but it belonged to the comfortable, far out of reach of a laid-off miner in a frozen mining town. Between those three, the rail line, the airplane, and the private car, there was a gap, a vast, overlooked, unserved gap. Millions of working Americans who needed to get from one place to another and had no affordable, reliable way to do it. Wickman did not set out to fill that gap. He set out to sell cars. He had scraped together just enough to try, and he had chosen a 7-passenger Hupmobile. And in a town full of miners who needed a way to move, he could not sell a single one. Not one. To anyone. Most men would have walked away. What Wickman did instead would, within 4 decades, grow into the largest transportation network the country had ever known. It would carry 250,000 people a day. It would earn its founder a knighthood from a Swedish king. And it would leave behind a lesson that business schools still teach, and that almost everyone, even now, gets wrong. Because the way this company rose tells you exactly why it fell. And both stories begin in the same place, with one man, one unsold car, and a problem everyone else had simply accepted. He looked at the car he could not sell, and he decided to drive it himself. Hibbing was a mining town. Alice, 15 miles to the south, was another. Between them ran no train, no bus, no service of any kind. Just frozen dirt road and hundreds of miners with no way to cross it. So Wickman began running a scheduled route in the Hupmobile he had failed to sell. 15 cents a ride. On his first day, he packed 18 miners into a vehicle built for 7. Picture that, 18 men folded into a 7-seat car, Wickman at the wheel in a Minnesota winter. Doing arithmetic in his head, and realizing he had walked into something that had not existed the morning before. A bus company. The first one in America. By the end of that first week, he was earning more in a day than he had ever made swinging a pick underground. That was not luck. That is what it looks like when a man pays attention to a problem everyone around him had accepted as simply the way things were. What came next came fast. In 1915, a motorcycle racer named Ralph Bogan was running a competing line from Hibbing to Duluth. Wickman did not try to crush him. He invited him in, absorbed the rival instead of fighting him. That instinct, repeated for 30 years, would become the engine of the whole enterprise. By the end of the First World War, Wickman owned 18 buses and was clearing $40,000 a year. By 1922, his network reached clear across the upper Midwest. He had the routes. He had the riders. He had everything except a name, and the men who actually built the machines he was running on. Both were about to arrive. The name arrived in 1926, and it arrived by accident. The account that comes down to us goes like this. A driver named Ed Stone was steering one of the company's gray-painted coaches through a small Wisconsin town when he caught its reflection in a storefront window. Lean, low, built to run. It looked, he said, like a Greyhound. The name stuck. By 1926, the Greyhound Corporation was official, and by 1927, its coaches were crossing the continent, California to New York, over roads that had barely earned the word. Now here is what most tellings of this story get wrong. And the error changes everything that comes after. Greyhound did not build its buses. Not at the start, not in the golden years, not during the post-war boom that made a Greyhound terminal as familiar as a train station. Those long silver coaches that defined the open American road in the 1940s and 1950s were built by General Motors through its yellow coach division. Greyhound bought them. Greyhound ran them. Greyhound was an operator, not a builder. A company whose genius lay in moving people, not in making the machines that moved them. That distinction isn't small. It was not. A company that rents its engineering can run an empire for decades on another man's invention. What it cannot easily do, when the ground shifts beneath it, is invent its way back out. Greyhound would not own a factory of its own until much later. And the road that finally took it there ran not through Detroit, but through a snow-covered town on the Canadian border, and a Russian immigrant most Americans have never heard of. But before we follow that road north, you have to understand how completely Greyhound had come to own the country it crossed. For 3 decades, it had worked a single advantage with quiet brilliance. The railroads were fast but fixed, the airlines were rising but costly and thin. The private car was spreading but still belonged to people with money to spare. Greyhound ran in the lane between all three, cheap, flexible, open to anyone who could find 15 cents and a station bench, not the wealthy, not the businessmen on an expense account. Everyone else, and there were so many of them, miners and mill hands, mothers traveling with children asleep against their shoulders, young people chasing work in cities they had never seen, immigrants who spoke no English but knew the one word that mattered, the name painted on the side of the coach that would carry them somewhere better. That was the company purpose, distilled to the bone. It's serve the unserved. And there is a second edge to that idea, one Greyhound never felt. To serve people who have no other choice is also, slowly, to own them. A company that owns its riders can forget, year by quiet year, that they were ever free to leave at all. For a long time, none of that showed. The numbers only climbed. By 1929, Greyhound carried 3 million passengers a year across 30,000 route miles. By 1935, the figure had reached 13 million. By 1955, the peak, it ran 5,000 coaches through 9,000 American communities, with 250,000 people boarding every single day. Leave the driving to us. A slogan, yes, but also a promise to a country that had never been fully stitched together. And for 30 years, Greyhound kept it. Which brings us, at last, to that town on the border. The town was Pembina, North Dakota, but the story that put it there began across the line, in Winnipeg, in 1932. A Russian immigrant named Harry Zoltok had turned a small repair shop into something he called the Fort Garry Motor Body and Paint Works. By 1933, he was building coach bodies of his own design, from the frame up. By 1943, the company had a new name, Motor Coach Industries. By 1948, Greyhound's Canadian arm was its largest shareholder, and in 1958, Greyhound bought the company outright. Read that year again, 1958. That is the moment Greyhound, the great operator, finally became a builder. And it became one the way it had done everything else, not by inventing, but by buying. It purchased a factory another immigrant had spent 26 years building, just as Wickman's own empire had been built by an immigrant 4 decades before. The rhyme is almost too clean. It is also the whole flaw in miniature. Even when Greyhound chose to make its own machines, it bought the ability to make them. It never grew it. In 1963, to feed the American market, MCI opened a plant 68 miles south of Winnipeg, in Pembina. The first coach off the line was the MC5. Within 10 years, the plant was turning out 500 a year. There was even an experiment, the MC6 Supercruiser, commissioned in 1967 with a stainless steel frame and a V12 engine so wide that several states ruled it illegal to run on their roads. A small detail. Also a tell. When this company reached for something ambitious, it reached past the rules instead of mastering them. At its height, the Pembina plant employed more than 1,000 people in a town that did not hold 1,000 permanent residents. Families built entire careers there, fathers and sons on the same line. The coaches they bolted together carried soldiers home from Vietnam and marchers. to the demonstrations of the civil rights years. That is what Pembina was. That is what would be standing in the room when the decisions in the next part of this story got made. Which leaves one question burning, the one worth holding on to. Why the life of that town would ever come to rest in a boardroom half a continent away. To understand the decisions that put all of that at risk, you have to start with the thing that looked like Greyhound's greatest strength. By the late 1950s, Greyhound controlled 85% of intercity bus travel in the United States. Sit with that number. Not market leadership, not a strong position, near total control of an entire American industry. There was almost nowhere you could go by bus in this country without going on a Greyhound. And that was the poison. Because when a company owns 85% of a market, the reasons to get better quietly disappear. Why improve the service when the rider has no other option? Why spend on new coaches when the old ones still fill? Why think about the passenger at all when the passenger has nowhere else to stand? Greyhound stopped building for the future and started squeezing the present. Maintenance schedules stretched. Fleet replacement slowed. New routes stopped opening. The company that had spent 30 years absorbing, expanding, and reaching shifted into a different posture entirely. It began to extract. And it did so at the worst possible moment, because the ground under it was already moving. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act authorized the interstate highway system, 40,000 miles of high-speed roads stitched across the country. At the same time, the automobile stopped being a luxury. The number of cars on American roads more than doubled in the years after the war. The very people who had once boarded a Greyhound because they had no other way to move were now buying used Chevrolets and driving themselves. Then, in 1978, Washington deregulated the airlines. What followed was exactly what economists predicted. Fares fell, and they fell hard. A bus ticket from New York to Chicago ran about $45 in 18 hours. A discount flight could be had for a little more, and took two. For the price of a decent dinner, a traveler could be home the same afternoon instead of sleeping upright through the night. Greyhound saw the threat. It even responded, but the response it chose was so badly misjudged that it did not slow the decline. It accelerated it, and it destroyed the one thing a company that moves people cannot survive. The man who made that choice had a name: John Tietz. Tietz had taken over as chief executive of the Greyhound Corporation in October 1981, and he had not come up through the buses. He came up through the company's restaurants and food service. He was a manager of portfolios, not of coaches, and he had already decided where the future was. It was not in transportation. That same year, the storm broke. Tietz sold off the company armor meatpacking division to Conagra for $2 billion and kept the consumer goods that would one day become Dial. He was assembling a conglomerate. The buses were ballast. So in 1983, Greyhound came to its unionized drivers and terminal workers with a demand: accept a cut of roughly 17% in wages and benefits. The company called it survival. Competition from the airlines was real. The bus line had reported some $34 million in operating losses over the previous 2 years, and blamed labor costs that ran far above its competitors. 62% of expenses against 40. The workers did not believe it. And here is why. The man demanding their sacrifice was, in the same breath, selling off divisions for billions and steering a thriving parent company towards soap. The corporation was not dying. Only the part that had built the name was being told to bleed. They voted it down, 96% against. The strike that followed lasted 47 days, and it turned ugly. Replacement drivers were hired. Buses were sabotaged and fired on. Bomb threats came in. Armed guards rode the coaches. When it ended, the drivers had accepted a 15% reduction, and the company had lost $25 million in revenue. But the real loss never showed up on a ledger. It was the trust of the people who rode the buses. On the morning the move began, the Polaris submarine mold was lifted from its press position, crated in a wooden frame, and loaded onto a moving truck. The mold had spent 24 years on the same Venice. They had depended on it because it was there, and because there was nothing else. The strike taught them something the company had long ago stopped fearing. There was something else. For 47 days, with the buses barely running, those riders went looking for another way to travel, and they found it. A neighbor with a car, a cheap flight. A different habit. This is the second edge of serving the unserved. The one Greyhound never felt coming. The people it had served were never loyal customers. They were captives. And the moment the door stood open, a great many of them simply walked through it and never came back. The numbers tell it plainly. Between 1980 and 1986, Greyhound's ridership fell by 55%. Not 5, not 15, 55. More than half the passengers, gone in 6 years. That is not a market headwind. That is a company in free fall. By the end of 1986, the Greyhound Corporation had decided it was done. In March 1987, it sold the bus operations to a Dallas-based investment group, led by a man named Fred Curry, a former Trailways executive, in a leveraged buyout worth $350 million. The operation was renamed Greyhound Lines, and its headquarters moved to Dallas. The old parent went its own way. 4 years later, it renamed itself Dial, after the soap, because buses no longer had anything to do with what it was. They kept the soap. They sold the buses. The new owners were financial engineers, not busmen. Their world was debt service, cost reduction, and the next quarter's numbers. Curry's first move was to buy the only national rival left, Trailways, and fold it in. On paper, a triumphant consolidation. In truth, a struggling company swallowing a dying one while its own foundation kept crumbling. Then, in 1990, the drivers struck again. This time it did not last 47 days. It dragged on for the better part of 3 years, and the company filed for bankruptcy that same year. The same mistake, made by new men who had learned nothing from the old ones. And now the question we left burning in that border town finally comes due. Through all of it, the strikes, the buyout, the bankruptcy, the MCCI plant in Pembina kept building coaches. But a factory that builds buses lives or dies on the health of the companies that buy them. As Greyhound lines shrank, the orders thinned. The fate of Pembina rested in those distant rooms for one plain reason. The men in them had stopped seeing a town at all. They saw a line item. Orders slowed, shifts were cut, and men who had spent their entire working lives on that line, fathers who had once stood beside their own fathers there, were let go into a region that had little else to offer them. The coaches they built had carried a country. The decisions that idled them were made by people who would never ride one. After that, the name simply changed hands. In 30 years, it passed through 4 owners, each one further from the road it was built to serve. The radio control market, which had been Habaco's growth engine, was getting eaten by Chinese manufacturers who could undercut on price. In 2017, Habaco's lenders began calling in covenants. The company brought in restructuring advisors and tried to refinance its debt. And in 2021, it sold Greyhound to Flixbus, a German technology company, for a fraction of what the brand had once been worth. And yet the factory itself did not die. In 2015, MCI passed to a company called New Flyer, and the Pembina plant, against the odds, kept running. A century after Wickman's first run through the snow, the place that built the coaches was still standing. The brand was another matter entirely. Here is the version of this story most people tell. Greyhound was killed by the automobile, killed by cheap airlines, killed by the interstate, killed by forces too large for any company to survive. That version is comforting, because it hands out no blame. It says Greyhound was a casualty of history. It is also wrong. The interstate did widen the reach of the car. Deregulation did make flying cheap. Both were real. Neither was a death sentence. European railroads faced the same budget airlines and answered by building high-speed lines that beat flying over medium distances. South was born out of that same deregulation and grew into the most profitable airline in the country. Industries get disrupted and adapt. Companies get disrupted and reinvent. The only real question is whether the people in charge will do the hard, costly work of remaking the thing, or whether they would rather drain what is left and leave before the bill comes due. Full liquidation. What was left of Habaco was carved up and sold off in pieces. Some brands found new owners. Others ceased to exist. The American company that had invented American plastic model kits no longer existed. So when the world demanded a different kind of company, Greyhound reached for the only tool it had ever owned. It cut. That is the kind of thinking I promised you at the start. Not one bad decision. A way of seeing the world in which a monopoly feels like safety, a captive feels like a customer. And the future is something you drain rather than something you build. It killed a company that once carried 250,000 people a day. And it is alive right now, in companies you trust, run by people certain their position is permanent. Carl Wickman did not live to see any of it. He retired as president in 1946, and on a return to Sweden, King Gustav V knighted him for serving the unserved. Not the wealthy, not the connected, the people with no other way. He died in 1954, before the strikes, before the bankruptcies, before his company was sold off to a British conglomerate, and then a German tech firm. He died believing he had connected a country at a moment when connection was hard to come by. He died right. What came after wore the same name. It was a different company. The running dog is still painted on the side of the coaches. But the thing that once meant something to every working American who needed to get somewhere now runs mostly on the memory of what it used to be. And in Hibbing, Minnesota, there is a museum. It stands in the town where a broke immigrant once folded 18 miners into a car built for 7, and, without meaning to, invented an industry. They walk past the old coaches, and some of them understand, maybe for the first time, what it looks like when one person with almost nothing sees a problem everyone else has accepted and decides to solve it anyway. That is how empires are built. The way they fall is always a choice. Because this was never really about buses. It was about what happens when a company forgets why it exists, treats the people it serves as captives, and trades its future for one more good quarter. That pattern did not die with Greyhound. This is the first story in the series. It will not be the last. If this one stayed with you, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me which moment landed hardest. The 18 miners folded into a 7-seat car? The day they kept the soap and sold the buses? Or the strike that taught a whole country it had a choice all along? If you know someone running a company, leading a team, or just certain their position is safe, send this their way. Like it, so the next person finds it. And subscribe. Because Greyhound is only the first empire we are taking apart. More are coming.